Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. We're continuing our coverage of the groundbreaking sound work being done in the world of gaming. Today we're talking about Star Wars Outlaws. It was one of the most popular and best-selling games released last year, and one of the reasons for its success is the cinematic experience of the gameplay, which is due in no small part to its incredible sound design, as well as its dynamic use of music. So today we are joined by my colleague at Dolby, Alistair Hurst, speaking with senior members of the game's sound design team to discuss their work on Star Wars Outlaws. I'll let Alistair take it from here.
Hi, I'm Alistair Hurst from Dolby Labs, and I'm here today with some of the audio team from Star Wars Outlaws. We're joined by Simon Kudryavtsov, the audio director, Jacob Coles, the lead audio designer, Martin Weisberg, the principal audio designer, and Simon Siegfried Klar, also known as Siggy, as the senior audio designer. So first off, I have to say I've been playing the game, and it really feels authentically like it belongs in the Star Wars universe. And obviously a big part of that is the sound pulling you into that universe, putting you in all those places that we know so well from the films and games. I'm just curious what your audio direction pillars were.
We first and foremost landed on three main pillars, first of them being a cinematic experience. And by this, we mean that we really wanted to have the music and the voice to be first and front in the mix, where we have the sound effects coming in after to help where needed. And we really wanted to kind of tell a story using audio and help the story of the game using audio.
Okay, let's just take a second here. Enough. Just come quietly. Who are you?
Run. I said, run.
Another aspect that we, aside from cinematic experience, of course, is that, as you mentioned, we wanted to be a true Star Wars experience, an authentic Star Wars experience. And in order to achieve this, we spent a lot of time researching, of course, all the movies, all the series, the games, to try and find kind of where we are in this vast galaxy of sounds. And one of the things that we found early on, of course, was the importance of getting a lot of original source recordings. So that's something that we focused on a lot early in the project. Now, finally, to kind of establish our own sound in the Star Wars IP, what we did is we coined a phrase that we call the scoundrel sound. And what this means is that it's about keeping the grit from the original trilogy, but also updating the sounds to make them sound fresh and new and, in a 2024 game, really. I think that's something that we discussed also is a thing that shouldn't be applied to sound design only, but this philosophy of creating this scoundrel feel would apply to also music and of course the voice design, because this philosophy needed to be true for all of the elements of audio in order to make a cohesive product in the end.
Get out of here! No! Work, you piece of scrag! Toshara. I'll take you anywhere. We're okay.
How did that collaboration with Lucasfilm Games go?
Honestly, it's been great. We had, first of all, we had access to their tremendous sound library, right? So that gave us a lot of insight in what the sounds actually sounded like from the films. So not a full mix, but we had access to stems and individual variations and so on. And it enabled us to kind of start our analysis and research on, okay, how did they approach this? What was the process behind this? And furthermore, we also had weekly calls scheduled with them where we could discuss the progress we're making, and we could put forward different items for review and such. and such things. And also, of course, since we had the opportunity of recreating these iconic sounds like TIE fighters or stormtroopers or ATSTs, of course, we wanted to have their input and blessing on whether we were going into the right direction. So it's been super, super helpful.
Tell us a bit more about your team. How big was your team? Where were they located? How did you distribute the work? That kind of thing.
We're kind of really across the world. We have obviously the team here at Massive in Sweden, and we have a team in Montreal, Toronto, Paris, Annecy, Bucharest, and of course in Shanghai as well. And the way that the kind of work was distributed was that we had our mandates to try and help things be a bit more evenly split. So Shanghai, for instance, took on the wildlife work. Paris took on some of the quest work, along with some mini games. We worked on a lot of the core gameplay pillars here at Massive. And then Annecy helped out with some more quest work and helping out with the world as well. So that made things a little bit easier to distribute. And the way that we kind of made sure that all gelled was that we had very clear onboarding when we brought studios on. We had the documents from Simon when it came to the direction, and a lot of reference that we did during the research process, showing our references, where we're setting our sound aesthetic. And then later on, just before we went to the full production, we managed to have an audio summit where we actually were lucky enough to get a lot of people from all the different teams here at Massive in Malmo. And, we got to meet face to face, exchanged secrets and tips and tricks, and really kind of get together and ready for the road ahead.
Yeah, that initial face-to-face meeting I found has definitely helped get things kicked off, doesn't it? Even if you're all working remotely afterwards. Great. And so, I'm curious, just keeping everybody in sync, was it, I assume early morning meetings and very late night meetings to, keep in touch with those teams all around the world?
Yeah, you can imagine when you have Shanghai on one end of the spectrum and then you have Montreal on the other side, it's quite tricky to find a time frame that works for everyone. But the way we ended up doing it is we had syncs with Shanghai, of course, and then we found a time that worked with the rest of us in Europe and also in America. And, we spoke quite frequently. We had chats, and we managed to keep in touch and feedback on each other and really have a sense that we could all reach out and ask for help or for advice and feedback. And really, despite the geographical challenges that we would possibly face, we still had this great feeling of one team, which was great.
And I think also here's where the summit helped a little bit as well, where when we're talking about meeting face to face, is that also helped us to establish the same vocabulary when it comes to sound, because something sounding warm, for instance, could mean different things to different people. So this gave us the opportunity to align there, I think. So it was great.
So speaking of challenges, it's an enormous open world game, a lot of locations. I'm just curious, what kind of environments did you need to create your ambiences for? And, how did you do that?
We were super excited by the challenge, of course, but it was very varied. You have the sandy Tatooine, you have the jungles of Akiva, you have the frosty plains of Kijimi. There is Ashara, which is our own location, I guess, and it's kind of a savanna type of biome. So there was a lot of variety needed for sure. And even besides those, we also had space and space locations, different space stations and cantinas, right? So, for sure, original source recordings was a big part of it, but then also figuring out a smart system to how to play it all back, really. And Sigi spent a lot of time doing this, so maybe you want to expand on this, Sigi.
We started pretty early in terms of concept art, that kind of stuff, with an idea of what we wanted these locations to sound like. We did a lot of location recording for these. For example, we knew Kijimi was a snowscaped location, so we went to north of Sweden. We were up there for almost a week, I think, straight, just recording ambiences, trying to get as much content as possible. While we were up there, we took impulse responses of the landscape and used those as reference. And we even recorded Foley while we were up there, just to get a sense of what do we want the final assets to sound like, and can we use these as a point of reference for the actual game? While we were there, we recorded a ton of other stuff, waterfalls as well, rivers, that kind of stuff. But we also went to an array of other places. So we went to Tasmania in Australia, and there we had the opportunity to go to the Maricopa and King Solomon caves, which is like a big underground cave network. We were able to get access to take impulse responses inside of those spaces, which again, we used as reference points for caves in both Toshara and as well the caves in Tatooine. And we also recorded like a ton of waterfalls, rivers, and of course there was a lot of bird sounds that we wanted to capture while we were there. So we took a lot of time to do field recordings. And then we also did a few trips on mainland Australia, kind of hunting for some specific birds, stuff that we thought would sound unique and give us our own take on the universe, but also stuff that we thought just sounded really strange and alien to get from the get-go, I guess.
Following the same principle, we had the chance to go to Tanzania. And what's interesting about Tanzania is that why we selected this place in the first place is that there's a lot of biomes right next to each other. So obviously a lot of savannas that were super important for Toshara, but also forests on the Kilimanjaro, some more arid places and so on, and a lot of wildlife also. So following the same principles, we try to record ambiences, but also single sounds like insects, birds, animals, anything that could sound outside of the ordinary and very unique, because one of the goal doing so much field recording and ambience recording is to come up with something that the player didn't hear before, or not reusing sound banks that everybody heard before. So that was really the intention here, coming up with something that would be really specific for our locations and new at the same time.
So one thing I've noticed playing the game when you're in cities is how, the space feels alive with all the, creatures, people, different races all around you. I'm curious, did you do Walla groups for that? How did you, there's obviously the NPCs, you hear a lot of the individual lines, but just the background feels alive. How did you accomplish that?
Our Walla system works in tandem, like in collaboration with the ambience, but it was designed and authored by Charles Pateman, our lead voice designer, and his team as well. And it's a systemic approach, but it kind of works like there's spatialized groups of Walla, and then on top of that, there's modular systems as well. So it's very reactive, and it looks at context while you're playing the game, how many NPCs are there, that kind of stuff. And then on top of that, there's also a lot of hand-authored creature sounds, different aliens from all the different, alien types in Star Wars. And a lot of time was spent in trying to capture that authentic like trilogy vibe and trying to portray that, I think a lot of people can take a look at, the Mos Eisley Cantina from A New Hope, and you can almost hear that scene from Star Wars just through, imagining the aliens. And I think voice had such a critical effect on conveying that aesthetic.
It's a balance of striking authenticity, but also having fun with it, right? So on the authentic side, we spent huge amounts of time making sure that the Huttese language was well represented in our game and was pronounced properly. We had a Huttese dialect coach for our voice actors and so on. But on the other flip side, we also had fun. So like speaking of the cantinas, I remember we had a challenge internally of who can make the most ridiculous sound, just to kind of squeeze something into those cantinas that sounds fun, So the challenge was for it not to be made with a human voice, and it had to be kind of ridiculous as possible, and a couple of different parameters. So we had everybody doing that challenge, and then we crammed in a lot of assets from that. So we had a lot of fun doing that as well. So.
You mentioned that you had different spatial groups. I'm curious, did you use the height channels at all for some of that stuff? Because, in the cities, it's multi-layered. Were there height channels involved in that?
We used height channels for things like loudspeakers and like air traffic and things like that. Like we used the objects in Wise for those kind of things, so we have the correct panning and really give that sense of height. I mean, Toshara, for instance, the city there has a spaceport on the roof of the city, so you're always constantly hearing to and from of ships flying over your head and really giving you that sense that you're in a 3D world with activity all around you, beyond that of the pads and the seeds that Siggy mentioned.
But I also think, like in Akiva, for instance, when it rained, we put some of those spatial seeds into the heights as well, so you could hear like raindrops, on the roof and stuff like that. That was also a nice touch, I think.
Yeah, and I think one thing we did try and avoid, at least, is like for things like waterfalls, which Akiva also has in close proximity to the city, was removing those height channels from those kind of just a little bit more kind of white noisy content assets like waterfalls and rivers, just so that we make the space for that kind of interesting detail that with the rain and the ships and little seeds.
The doors and everything feels very Star Wars, and you said you had access to the original sound effects. I'm just curious, did you do much source recording for things like props like the buttons or doors or those kinds of things in the various levels, and how did you keep those feeling like they were in the Star Wars universe?
One thing that we did in terms of recording is we had access to an old submarine. I think it was for World War One. So it was fitting exactly the style that we were looking when it comes to knobs, doors, buttons, a little rugged and not too clean and too modern in that sense. We also had access to an old plane cockpit for the same kind of sounds with levers and more buttons, cranks, and you can really feel that mix between metal and plastic. It's kind of undefined technology that is, in my opinion, very close to what Star Wars is when you manipulate the cockpit of a spaceship or the click of a speeder. But also Siggy had access to some of the sounds that were very useful for us, in particular the doors.
Yeah, so we got access to like a industrial shipping area, and in that area there was a bunch of different freight trucks, the real big ones with the really loud air compression brakes. So we got to sample as much of that kind of content as we wanted. So we ended up with quite a fair few variations of that kind of iconic flavor that you can use for the Star Wars doors, that real kind of sounds and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I forgot to mention, it's we also had the occasion of recording 6-axis robots, and for this case they were super modern, but once treated and kind of retrofitted in the aesthetic that we were looking after, they work great for any kind of servos and so on, because that's one of the things that we wanted, is that we didn't want to reuse the same sounds over and over, so we really wanted to try to expand the palette, and those were very useful.
As I was playing the game, I realized there was one thing that you actually got really right that if you'd gotten wrong would have been a problem, and that was your companion animal, Nix, right? The vocalizations is very emotional, and you're able to build up this relationship, and it's important that you do that because I don't know if it's a he or she, is with you through that entire time. How did you, get the vocalizations for Nix?
It was not an easy task because obviously, as you say, he's with you all the time. So we toyed around with different approaches. At first, we were thinking like this would be more like a voice design task. And then we kind of tried like, let's maybe try a bit more sound design approach, combining like different animals and stuff like that. But what we really found is in order to express emotion and and doing so in a believable way, it needed to be based on a human performance.
Nix, watch out! Oh, you little... Come back, Nix.
So we actually got D. Bradley Baker, who is a great voice actor and has done a lot of Star Wars work before. And the things that he can do with his voice is just, it's not from this world. I don't know how he does it, but what you hear is actually mostly his voice. And only in certain occasions did we opt into adding a different layer. For instance, if Nix is angry and he's doing a bit of a growl, then there might be some animal sounds layered underneath. But mostly it's about combining different phrases of D's performance and kind of editing it so it fits the scene, whether that's a cinematic or a systemic bark. And yeah, the work here mostly was done by Oscar Hansson, who is a voice designer on the team as well. And yeah, he spent countless amounts of hours with D, showing him gameplay, showing him cinematics, showing him what Nix can do, and D would perform to that, and we would basically build up a pool of assets that we could then stitch together, layer together, process a little bit so it feels cohesive. But yeah, that's essentially the creation of Nix.
Let's move on to the weapons. How did you approach creating all the different weapon sounds that are in the game?
When it comes to Star Wars, there's obviously a lot of legacy for the blasters. But there is one blaster that has been basically remaining the same over the course of the trilogies, the movies, and the series is the E11. That sounded like a good starting point to be able to recreate the E11 in a more gamified and 2024 version and create a reference point for our game. So the way we approached it is that we took a snippet of Mandalorian and basically beef up in a game version that sound. So we started by this, and once we found the right balance that seemed cool enough for a video game, yet still belonging to the movies or to the series, we used that as a reference point. And then from there, everything was whether smaller than the E11, whether bigger than the E11. And when it comes to the textures themselves, we had a mix between more modern recordings and also older sound banks that were relevant for the era and what we were trying to accomplish. Some tape recorded explosions and so on. So we really tried to do a modern take on what was done originally and not deviate from the original sounds, the original trilogy and so on, and also Rogue One. But we didn't want to sound exactly like the 80s or the 79. Yet we wanted to pay homage to the original sounds, and I think that really influenced the weapon sounds and the soundscape in general. Anyway.
I'm curious, when it came to reflecting the upgrades for Kay's blaster, how did you approach that? Because you obviously, had to get it into this box to fit into that universe, but then at the same time reflect these different upgrades, which, you need to get across to the player.
So I think first and foremost, we had to figure out what Kay's blaster would sound like. And one thing that we learned from Lucasfilm's games is that the weapons and the tools are ultimately the reflection of the characters themselves. And we have great examples in that, like Han Solo blasters and so on. So we wanted to create the same the same kind of relationship between Kay and her blaster. It's very iconic, and it's really her own blaster, and it has a story to it. So once we figured out how it would sound after many trial and errors and iterations, what was important for us is that there is a link that connects every modules. So whether you shift to an iron module, an explosive, or something like this, there should be always a relationship to the original blaster, and that was really important for us. So obviously we switched some layers, and some are more powerful, and the impacts are more powerful than others. The tails also being modified depending on what module you're using. But what was really important is that it didn't feel like a new weapon, but rather a modification of the original blaster that Kay comes with.
I imagine, getting the sound to reflect what the upgrades of your blaster were kind of an interesting challenge. Any thoughts on how you approached that?
Yes, we try to do different things depending on what it was. Like I was mentioning the iron before, and then we had the same process on like what is actually iron in the Star Wars lore, and then reflect that into the sound, and obviously serving gameplay and what would you use iron for, and then reflect that into the sound, because it's closely related to the gameplay and what the designers had in mind when they were designing the gun, and how the player is supposed to use it in the game. For example, we took a base on the weapon and then modified that when it comes to the projectile itself, but also the impacts and the effects that it can have on droids, let's say. And we try to do all of that while respecting the frame of Star Wars. So it was about finding the right balance, what's exciting for the player, and where we're coming from, and the legacy from Star Wars, and the gameplay ID that are behind switching modules in the heat of combat.
Another category of sounds which sort of has the same challenges of matching the aesthetic from the movies, but then also updating it for the game was the vehicles. Is just curious, how you approach the sounds for the speeder, and your spaceship, the Trailblazer.
So in both cases, they have similar kind of challenges to try and solve. One is that in this case of the speeder, we have this fun traversal vehicle that gets you from A to B in a quick fashion, faster than running. But at the same time, it has to be an element of fun. It has to be reactive. You can go around the world, go up ramps, do jumps, landings, and have a really good time whilst enjoying the fantastic worlds that have been crafted. It was kind of finding that line of making it interesting and exciting, but at the same time, making sure that when moments you don't want it to be in your face, that there's enough content and design there that you can strip it back, still have that iconic nature of the speeder carry on, but it kind of is a bit more pushed to the background, so you can let the world breathe. Or maybe in the case of something like a speeder chase, maybe then the focus is on the speeders chasing you, and you have a little bit of stuff carrying on, but you still have a sense of the speeder. So a lot of the challenges with these vehicles was kind of making sure that they kind of cover all the needs that we need to have. And then once we had that kind of spec list, it was then, finding the language of how the vehicle should be told in terms of like comparing to, the speeders of the shows, and making sure that they fit. With the case of the speeder, there's also the aspect of grounding it. So making sure that we have the material of the world. So when we go over the big lake in Akiva, that we really feel that like connection to what we're seeing. And again, adds a little bit more fun of the splashes. And when you're drifting, you get all the kind of water settling, and it makes it very active. With the Trailblazer, again, in terms of the technical aspect of it, it has a similar kind of challenge in that it's in space. It's kind of the anchoring aspect of the soundscape. At least on the planet, you have the kind of ambience, you have spatial seeds playing fauna and bushes, and you have other vehicles going past. But in space, it's kind of fairly a bit more stripped back, and you have the Trailblazer being the main central point. And so with that, again, it's kind of treading that line between making it exciting when you want to burst away and do a stunt. At the same time, you want to make sure that over time, if you're just flying straight in a direction towards a space station, that it doesn't become fatiguing, and making sure that there's still elements there that route you, but it just gives way to other areas of interest. A big inspiration for that when we were doing the early analysis of the movies and the TV shows was a little bit of the case of like when things go on screen, you kind of get that moment of excitement, and then you kind of push it away, and making sure that things are always dynamic and there's always that new element of focus and variety playing out. So it was, in both cases for vehicles, it was all about dynamism, a kind of player's toolbox for playtime, but also serving as kind of an anchoring of the mix, I would say.
So it sounds like there's multiple layers of elements that you were able to bring in and out and manipulate. I'm just curious, how many layers, made up the sound of the Speeder or the Trailblazer?
For the Speeder, what I can recall, I'm not really sure anymore, but I think there's permanently 5 layers when it comes to the pure engine sound itself. There is what I would call the grounded sci-fi layers that are not the general sound that we can hear. And then there's also a sound that is just related to the thruster and that we plugged onto the VFX. So when you press the trigger and you see the thruster and the flame that is going, it goes with it, and then just recedes when you release the trigger. But the main sound, the main engine with the tremolo keeps on going. Because you can also do that on the ramp down. So even if you're not accelerating, your speeder will keep on moving. So we still need to do that. On top of that, like Jacob mentioned, there is everything related to the material that you're traversing. And that would be just for the loop that the speeder is made of in general. And then above this, we can add all the one-shots that are related to the jumping, the braking, the landing, the boost, and so on. playing at the same time at the minimum 5, but then there is probably around 15 or 20 categories of sound contained into the project itself, but it's just not playing at the same time. And for the Trailblazer, there's a little less than that because the speeder has such a physicality related to the terrain, where the Trailblazer is moving into space. But the Trailblazer had its own, I would say, specificities when it comes to stunt and so on, which are now more based on one shots, and the loops takes back, and so on. So that's about that.
I noticed with the Trailblazer, even if you're going a straight line to another planet or something, there's this great sense of motion because of phasing. Was that an external effect, or was that by having similar loops layered on top of each other? How did you get that great sense of motion?
It's a bit of both. I think there's when we were creating the loops, the original recipe was really close from what we thought the Millennium Falcon could sound. So there's effects with made on top of tape recorded explosions and loops like this. I think that's what gives the most, I would say, the flesh of the Trailblazer. But there is also loops in the background, and even when you're just going in a straight line, what we wanted to avoid is linearity. That was, I think, our biggest enemies, quote unquote. So even when you're not doing anything and you're just accelerating, things in game kind of goes up and down in a way that it never feels like it's just a tone evolving. And then also one of the layer that was used for this one is we recorded OB6. It's an analog synthesizer, and within that loop, when we were synthesizing it, we tried to have something that is ever evolving.
Punch it.
This is Akiva.
It's very responsive, the vehicles as well. So I'm just curious what game parameters you're using to feed in to control, and what aspects of the sound were you controlling from that? Obviously the different layers, but there was a lot to it to make it so responsive.
So for the Trailblazer, being a spaceship, we're utilizing a lot of the kind of spaceship engine parameters. So pitch, yaw, tilt, rotation, those kind of things. And for each of these parameters, we're doing a lot of things with kind of filtering and pitching and volume adjustments and bringing in new content. And it can be a case of if you tilt one way, that it's a different effect if you tilt the other way. So the whole time that you're kind of flying and spiraling and dogfighting, that the context between the layers and the pitch relationships are always evolving and changing. And of course, by pitching certain layers, then they're changing their sync points, and everything is just constantly modulating.
On our left. You're hit.
Shields down! All right!
The one thing that you and Martin found when you're working on the speeder is the kind of adding elements of chaos would actually make it more fun, like in the case of the speeder tremolo, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like I think initially, we attempted having a fairly straightforward engine kind of modulation when it comes to tremolo, just to see how it would feel, kind of a little bit similar to kind of a motocross bike. But of course, motocross bikes are kind of fairly fatiguing, and actually we found that having that kind of linear relationship a little bit dull. So actually having that element of it not being a straight tremolo curve, having a relationship with speed, it had a little bit more of a different shape. And then the shape of the tremolo and the speed of how much it oscillates and how deep that LFO is would change based on how much you're turning, how fast you're going, are you in the air, are you landing, are you slowing down, all types of things to try and make sure that there's always a little bit of life in the engine and it's not just a static feeling, like, because that might feel like a loop, that it's a living and breathing engine. That at least was the goal that we set out with.
I think you succeeded because, like I said, the vehicles definitely feel very responsive, very dynamic, and never static and boring.
As Martin was saying before, where like Kay's toolbox or blaster and then the vehicles are almost an extension of a character. I think there's like a nice parallel between all of them, because if you look, for instance, at Kay's blaster upgrades, or you look at the speeder upgrades, or even the Trailblazer upgrades, we kind of approached all of them with the same philosophy, and especially for the Trailblazer, which has a lot of weapon upgrades to the blaster or to the actual. There's missiles and the blasting fire and everything. So I think it was kind of nice to kind of approach all of them in the same way.
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly what was really interesting working on the speeder and the Trailblazer is that it needs to, in a pure Star Wars fashion, it needs to feel real. And we used a lot of what express speed in our life type of sounds also, but we had that freedom to add a little chaos and a little humor and a little playful and colorful to it, and that really was fun to deal with.
Let's move on to the mix, because I'm sure with such a huge world, you would need to have sort of systemic systems to make this all work and bring it all together. I'm just curious, how did you approach the mix? How did you organize and balance all the various categories? How did you tackle that problem of a mix for such a big open world game?
Yeah, so we had a lot of tricks at our disposal, luckily, with modern games and all the kind of CPU extra goodiness that you have. The first step that we had was that we had a way of reducing the amount of things triggering based on circumstances. So it's almost like the process of cutting before you even get to a stage of clutter. So in combat, we could reduce the sound of maybe dust dropping and little incidental objects, and therefore allow more space from that side of things. And then for the things that we're actually playing, we had two big bus structures. We had an HDR structure, HDR basically being a priority system based on loudness or importance. And basically the most important sounds are given free rein to push the things that are less important down in volume. And so this chunk of buses contained pretty much all the gameplay features, so weapons and some explosions, some gadgets, some kind of objects that could be pushed down, some ambience that could be pushed down, NPC weapons, speeders, spaceships, you name it. Everything that kind of interplays and makes sure that you have a clear priority in place for the mix. On the other side of the mix, we have a non-HDR group, and that contained voice and music, our primary kind of pillars that Simon mentioned at the beginning, our main drivers of the mix. And what these were doing was that when the mix was busy, with a lot of SFX triggering, then we would send the VO to a meter, the important VO that is, and depending on how much meter is being sent, we would then drive some EQ of certain SFX groups so that we could carve in some space a bit more transparently to make sure that a VO is kind of cutting through, but not in just a volume ducking point of view. We're just cutting a few carving here and there with EQs. And, if it's still quite busy in certain moments, like a speeder chase, we're also boosting some high end and some clarity off the VO, so that we're just giving that VO a little bit of a boost. So between the HDR buses and the non-HDR buses, we're kind of handling a lot of these things. And I think in the end, we had, over 130 buses, I believe. So we're pretty granular, but what that did do was it enabled us to be very specific. And that's very specific when it comes to things like in-game cinematics, that we can say, okay, in this cinematic, we want to make sure that there's no particles at this emotional moment, because maybe having some spark sounds doesn't make a lot of sense. And then maybe towards the end into gameplay, we can slowly bring it up again.
You got some secret backup plan, right? Keep firing! This is getting bad. Any bad? This is bad, Kate! We can do this! Okay, we can do this! Keep focused! They won't let up that easy! Next, find cover!
All those kind of decision making was made easier by having a big bus structure.
What did mixing in Dolby Atmos bring to the mix?
Well, it's something that we encouraged the team to do as early as possible when we had a good build up and running. It's just something that I felt added a lot of depth to the mix, not only in terms of vertical experience of sounds that are higher up above or something like that, but also gave the sounds that are behind you, like enemies or spaceships, or even to the sides. It just felt like the whole palette has gotten bigger, really. So it gave us much more room to play with. And also, we had fun with it as well. We did select certain things to be dynamic objects. So Nix, as you mentioned before, he's totally dynamic. All of his movements and vocalizations, he's when you play on headphones, it really comes off like he's next to you. We also opted for spaceship flybys as well, which I think feels really, really cool in space. Like spatial scenes, like we said before, like sounds of rain and stuff like that. So I think it overall just gave a greater sense of depth and clarity and precision to the mix.
I think I would add also the fact that it was not just the mix in Dolby Atmos that helped us, but it's also at the creation of the assets. We suddenly have more channels to split the energy from, and just that is a great help. It also helped with the cutscenes that are also in full Atmos with elevation and so on. And it's just more speakers that we can play with, and that just give us more options, really. And I go back to the energy splitting. That is, in case of loud sounds like explosions and blasters and pass-bys and all that stuff, we get to choose where we want to have them, and that gives us more space in general.
Let's get out of here.
How early in the process did you start mixing in Atmos?
We encouraged the team to play in Atmos as much as possible, but we also had to check the mix on various other formats as well, stereo, 5.1, 7.1. Towards the end of the project, when we're doing the final mix, of course, we also tested things like TV speakers and sound bars and various types of headphones to make sure that the mix translates well. And we even added some extra options in the settings menu for depending on which dynamic range you want and what kind of output you want to play on.
So another element that we haven't discussed yet is the music, which fits right in there. I have to say, as I was playing the game, noticed how appropriate the music was so much of the time, or most of the time, actually. It's an interesting combination of new synth elements and the classic, episode 4 I'd say Will Roger and his team, did a great job on that. And he and I, we're both in the Seattle area here. I've had some good conversations with him about that, and he's done a number of interviews. So we'll leave people to go check those if they want. But let's dig into the implementation side a bit. I'm just curious, how did you make it seem so seamless that the music would just come in at the right time, would exit at the right time, or transition? That was all done very well. I assume, kudos to the editors for this, and there's probably the implementation. There was quite a bit involved. How did that work?
It's a combination of things. For sure, it's the editors, but also it's Eric Jakobsson, who is our senior music designer, who designed a great open world music system that was able to take care of any situation, really. So, yeah, I mean, Wilbert has done a fantastic job on the score. And I think once me and Eric started getting the assets from Wilbert, we sat down and really talked about it at first, like, how do we design this? What's the most important thing, right? And we wanted the music for sure to be seamless. We wanted it to be reactive. And we also wanted it to kind of portray the sense of adventure. So what we sat down to do is to break down really the elements of our game and discuss, okay, where do we need music? How are we going to do this? How are we going to support quests? How are we supporting open world? And while some solutions we came up with were like fairly basic for games, I think the one solution that stands out, or the part of the system that stands out, is the open world system itself, where we first looked, at, okay, where is the player? What location is this? So that exploration music kind of has its own flavor. And then as you progress through the game, we look at what the player does, and if the player is exploring, if the player is maybe hiding from enemies, or is about to go into combat, in full combat, or if he's just left combat, all of these kind of switches, they would select the appropriate music to play. So for all locations and for the various factions that would be in these locations, we would have different suits of music playing.
Go get him, buddy. Go to one.
What's going on?
Get me.
I got her!
What would I do without you, little guy?
There's two keys to keeping it seamless, and the first one would be that we kind of wanted to avoid the feeling of the music fading in and fading out all the time. We kind of wanted to feel consistent. And so in order to achieve this, we kind of combined both a vertical and a horizontal music approach, meaning that we used a lot of transitions to get us from one state to the next state of the music system, and not just crossfades, but actually composed pieces of music that help transition between the different elements. But also, as we would get to, let's say, if you're fighting the stormtroopers on Toshara, you would get into the main combat part of that. We would then have three different layers that Wilbert would compose. One that's kind of combat low, one that's combat mid, and one that's combat high. And those three layers would essentially be kind of the same piece of music, but we would transition between those seamlessly using the game parameters that the game would send to Wise. So we would look at things like how many enemies are around you, what's the kind of danger value of them, as opposed to what kind of threat are they posing to the player, what's the player health, and various parameters like that. And these would then be combined to kind of drive thresholds, and those thresholds would then drive the music system to kind of seamlessly bring in low, mid, high combat, or go into a transition to a hiding state, because stealth was kind of a big element in our game as well, right? So I think that's all cred goes to Eric there, because he really made it work seamlessly. And of course, Wilbert's content only makes it even better.
Who was that? What's that? What's that? This area is off limits. See something?
What was that?
None of we said.
Raising the alarm! Have a shot!
Turn off that alarm! Repent, Nix! They won't quit! We're pinned down! We are doing this the hard way. Fine, really.
Acknowledge TK5621. Permission to use force. Neutralize the target.
Over here! Where is he? Find him. Where is he?
How much communication was going on with the composing team during the gameplay, or even before you set it up? And, if you had any advice or, lessons learned that you could pass on to other teams of how to make that process easier and, work as well as it did for your game.
Well, for me, it was interesting because it was actually, Massive traditionally have released several games, but we've always had an in-house composer for the Division series, for instance. So for me, working with Wilbert was actually the first time working with an external composer. So I kind of had to learn the ropes as I went with it. But one thing that is probably a good takeaway from the whole process is that there was a lot of trust, and I left a lot of the kind of compositional decisions up to him, and I was giving him more references of the kind of tone we wanted to hit. Of course, I was sending him a lot of videos of the game, and we were discussing different approaches. And a big part of it was this initial brainstorm of how do we break down the needs of the music for this game, whether that's cutscenes, locations, or do we want music to play when you and a trailblazer chase, or do we want quirky music in this cutscene? And there's so many different needs. But I think really it just came down to making a solid plan and then trusting him with the compositional skills, as well as the co-composers John and Kazuma, who also did a fantastic job. I think another honorable mention is, of course, Cody Matthew Johnson, who did all the Cantina music, which also is fantastic. So I think I mostly tried to guide them into what we need and the tone that we're looking for, and left a lot of the composition work up to them. Of course, we also had Lucasfilm Games involved in reviews, making sure that if we're writing music for a specific planet or for a specific faction, that it feels right. So there was a little bit of back and forth there as well between them, us, and the composers. But all in all, it was, just super happy to have found Wilbert and his team, and that it went so well.
I'd like to thank you guys for an interesting interview. There's been some very interesting insights here, which I hope are useful for other people. I'm just curious, one last question. Simon, if you could go back what would you say to, Simon at the beginning of this project, some advice for how you would, make sure that you come out the other end of such a huge project with, such an iconic IP to get through this at the level that you did?
I would probably just say, hold on, man. It's going to be a bumpy ride, but it's going to be fine in the end. No. I mean, it was definitely a super fun project to work on, and I think it's not just me; it's the entire team. It's the people here on the interview, but also everyone else that was involved in the collaboration. I think at Massive, but also our co-dev studios. I think everyone just did their best, and we all came together and made this work.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Many thanks to Alistair and all the folks at Massive Entertainment for joining us on the podcast today. And an extra special thanks to Lucasfilm Games for all that great gameplay footage and behind-the-scenes B-roll. Star Wars Outlaws is now available on gaming consoles as well as PCs and in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos on compatible systems. You can find links to the game, as always, in our show notes. And if you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers and video game developers and sound designers talking about the creative ways they use technology to tell their stories, be sure you're subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. If you're curious to know more about what we do at Dolby Creator Lab, head on over to dolbycreatorlab.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of the show, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining us.